Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence and have fun doing it. I'm Justin, and I'm coming at you from the center right. As an engineer, I really enjoy processes. I'm data driven, and so I'll do my best to filter out all the nonsense that we typically see in politics and find reliable signals.
I'm Jonathan. I'm much more center left-ish than Justin, and I will probably be a lot of the nonsense he's going to be trying to figure out or filter out as I come from a sort of a professor's perspective. This week, I don't know if you've noticed yet, but I've got a fancy new shirt, a Pliny for President shirt. I was all in on this because I have my favorite beer here this week, Pliny the Elder. It combines two of my favorite interests, which are beers and IPAs, and ancient Rome. I was fortunate enough to go to Pompeii last summer, not this summer, and see where Pliny actually died trying to rescue people. But they've got a lot of stuff in memoriam for Pliny the Elder. So great stuff for a great beer and a fun little side note where not taking the politics quite as seriously all the time, which we can really probably all benefit from.
Right. And unfortunately, this will be a pretty serious podcast today. We're going to be discussing the state of the race. We're going to talk polling. We're going to talk election modeling and forecasting. So it's really nerdy stuff. But hopefully you learned something. And then we're also going to talk about the tariff policy of both Trump and Kamala Harris, because that's part of our recurring economics segment.
Before we jump into that, I do want to say one serious thing because I have a rant for the day. One of the issues that really invariably every time ticks me off quite a bit is Holocaust denial. And I really want to call out Tucker Carlson and J.D. Vance for the nonsense that they've been putting out this week. This is something that always bothers me. I'm not Jewish, and I don't have, as far as I know, any relatives that perished in the Holocaust. But it's just like the ultimate in gaslighting, and it's offensive and insulting in every way. And Tucker Carlson this week interviewed this imbecile named Daryl Cooper, who you should not even know who he is, but he shouldn't be on the air. And he shouldn't be able to spread views like, oh, you know what? The Nazis didn't intend to kill any Jews. They just died because they didn't have any place to put them with enough resources to feed them. Right? This is just ridiculous. And to make matters worse, then you have Elon Musk saying, oh, this is interesting and worth checking out. And J.D. Vance refusing to distance himself or saying anything because he's not going to succumb to cancel culture. And he's got an upcoming event with Tucker Carlson. It's like, I'm not big in cancel culture, but we can cancel the Nazis. I think that's fair to do. It just shows that there's just no depth to what certain people will not stoop to get or keep power and money. And it's something that I feel better about myself for saying this is just wrong and we can't have this.
Sure.
So that's my rant for the day.
Completely understandable. I think next week we're going to talk about foreign interference in our elections, and this is all very related, right?
Right.
We've recently had a indictment on Tenet Media, and they funded certain right-wing podcasters such as Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, what have you. So we're going to talk about that next week, but all of this is related. But anyway, stay tuned for more lighthearted and nerdy stuff. Enjoy. All right. So it's September. It's after Labor Day. Now people are starting to pay attention to the election. Most people are not insane like we are, obsessing over politics. So I'd like to talk about just where we are in the race.
Okay.
At a high level, it's a coin flip. No one really has a huge advantage here. I would probably say that from a historical perspective, Trump has like a slight edge, but Kamala could easily overcome that. And so
you're not buying the people that think she's ahead.
No, definitely not. At the end of the day, and we'll get into this a bit later, there are 93 electoral votes up for grabs, where the margin of the polling difference is less than 3 points, right? So it's really anyone's game. A good, solid campaign in these swing states is going to dictate who ends up winning. Um, so, how do we, analyze this, right? Um, a lot of people are going to do the wrong thing, and they're going to look at an individual poll that comes out that will say something that is a bit scary. If you're a Republican and you see that Kamala Harris is suddenly up in North Carolina, big yikes. Likewise, if Harris is down in Pennsylvania by 2 or 3 points, that's catastrophic if you're a Democrat. So what we end up doing is we just aggregate all the polls, and there's kind of a slogan for the politically seasoned people to just say, add it to the pile. Because at the end of the day, we want to operate off of consensus. It is possible that some of these outlier polls are correct, the ones that defy the consensus. But historically speaking, the polling averages are just more accurate in terms of predictability. A lot of people are going to remember that in 2016, Trump overperformed. And then in 2020, he also overperformed again. There's no reason to think that Trump will overperform in 2024. It's certainly possible. But all these polling organizations are well aware of the misses of the past, and they've been adjusting accordingly. So really, it could go in either direction, polling error. There's no rule, so to speak, that says, oh, the polling is always going to underestimate Republicans. It's certainly possible that, young voters might turn out heavily in this election and tip it towards the Democrats over the abortion issue. We did see that in 2022 in certain regions. And then Republicans overperformed in places like New York during the 2022 midterms, which is why the Democrats didn't end up winning the House.
So I think what's interesting about that discussion in terms of overperforming, who's likely to do what or not, is stuff I've read from pollsters is like they think that something weird happens when Trump himself is on the ballot. In the midterm races in 2018 and 2022, they seem to have done better with the predictions in the polls than in years when Trump is actually on the ballot himself. So it remains to be seen if they've tried to correct for that with what they do in sampling, which we'll get into in a second. So if their methodology is better able to do that. So I think it's worth talking about that methodology now. And I like to start with the question, well, why do we care about polling so much? And the main reason is it's the only real snapshot of the race out there for you, right? It helps campaigns refine strategy, helps them know where they are. They do their own polling in addition to the public polling, because campaigns obviously want to know what things are at, because they basically kind of have two goals they're pursuing, right? They want to, one, persuade undecided voters to vote for their guy, or woman in this case, and then they need to make sure that their supporters get out and vote. So this polling will help them, hopefully, that's their hopes anyway, figure out where to focus their resources, right? If they know, oh, this type of voter is undecided, this is what we can do to reach them. Or this state, we have these people who are our supporters, but they're a little weak. We need to make sure they get to the polls. And polling is hopefully, what they hope anyway, going to be the tool that help them figure out what's going on with that.
Right. And I should note that most campaigns have internal polling that we don't have access to. And they use that to make decisions, but they also use public polling. So, for instance, universities will partner with a news organization, things like that. And the campaigns use the internal polls. The campaigns use the public polls to make sure that the internal polling is within expectations.
And so one thing when you're talking about all these different polls and how to make sense of them, I think one thing that's sort of underplayed is the error, right? There's error built into polling in all sorts of levels that tends to kind of go underreported or at least underappreciated when people are talking about poll results, right? Anytime you do a poll, you're picking a subset of a population, and you may or may not get a subset that's actually reflective of the larger population. So you're going to have error in that. The smaller sample size you have, the more error it's going to be. And I'm going to apologize for being a little statistically dorky here, but I think these are things that are useful to cover when you're trying to make sense of polls. So there's error there for just, you might grab the wrong people. But then what pollsters try to do is like, well, given the subset of people we got, what can we do to make these answers more representative of the larger population? So if they only got, say they were doing a poll and they got 60 men and 30 women, that would be a problem because women are generally at least half of the population. They tend to vote more than men. So you'd probably then you'd weight women's responses twice, right? You'd count each man's response once, you'd count each woman's response twice. Okay, maybe that's going to even things out, but maybe your 30 women have just really weird views and you've double weighted really weird views. So there's error when you weight. There's error from your sampling. And then there's also error when you decide, you know what, we're not just going to poll everybody we talk to on the phone. We're going to make sure they're either registered voters, which injects a little bit of error right there, or even more error if you say we're going to figure out of these registered voters and people who aren't even registered yet, who's likely to vote. So there's another calculation, another algorithm there to figure out who's likely to vote. So you're figuring out who's likely to vote, and then you're figuring out what is the weight of these people in our sample. How does that compare to the broader population? And then what do we get? What is our error just from using a small sample size? So there is a lot of error in there. And despite this, you get some of these poll aggregating places, especially, who are very precise in their calculations. 538, for example, I follow them just because I'm interested in the polling. Today, they changed, they think Harris is only up 3.1% versus 3.2% yesterday, based on a couple polls that seem to be outliers in terms of, and also sponsored by Republican organizations that indicate Trump might be ahead. So they're translating this stuff that pretty error prone, riddled with a lot of error, into very precise measurements, which I think does us a disservice when we're trying to figure out what the actual state of play really is.
Well, and I think this is why it's important to just average everything out, right? Mm-hmm. One poll might have error in one direction, another poll might have error in the other direction. And ideally, when you aggregate these things, that type of error that you're talking about goes away. Now, what aggregating polls won't do is directional error that everyone's affected by, right? Sure. So if everyone...
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, even when you do that, it still doesn't take error away enough that you can distinguish between a 3.1% lead and a 3.2% lead. That's, right, to me, is a distinction without a difference, as they like to say.
But yeah, if everyone has roughly the same idea of what the likely voter model is, mm-hmm. That's where you're going to get that systematic error, where yes. you would miss these Trump voters who only want to vote for Trump and they don't appear anywhere else. Mm-hmm. Now, thankfully, I think these polling aggregators are pretty upfront about that. When they talk about their results, they don't say something like, "Oh, there's a 0.1 difference," right? They will basically say, "Oh, it's noise." So I think it's important for these organizations to just communicate, right, and sure. explain that a difference between 3.2 and 3.1. Just ignore that; it's just a number.
Except that's their headline thing, right? If you go to their polling right. page, that's the big. They don't. You got to read farther in to get right. past the. It's really not as precise as we're telling you right here. So
right.
I know some of that is you need to do that to get people in, but it's still, it gives people sort of false impressions. If we go back, say, to 2016, when everybody was suggesting, "Oh, Hillary Clinton has it in the bag," that didn't really turn out that way for them. They were, even though they will defend, Nate Silver in particular will defend how well he did, and it's like, nonetheless, you still predicted that Hillary was going to lose, where Hillary was going to win. So right. you got to, as you were saying, it doesn't make sense to light your hair on fire every time a poll comes in, right? Take all these polls with a realization that, you know what, there's error built in, and will make more sense when we look at a number of polls rather than any one particular poll.
Right. So I just want to give a shout out to some of the polling aggregators that I use on a daily basis. I hate to say that, but I do. So 538 is good. The New York Times has their own polling aggregation. Split ticket, I'm a real big fan of. And then historically speaking, Real Clear Politics was good from my perspective, but it's seems to be gamed by a lot of these partisan pollsters who just like to crank out polls and thus bias the total result. So I prefer
online try to game the system.
Right.
No.
So this is why I prefer organizations like 538 and Split Ticket, because they adjust, the aggregation, and they're less prone to being abused in that regard. Now, on the other side, though, and I think this is really useful for people who just want to check in every now and then, we have electoral race classifications. So there's two organizations I like, the Cook Political Report and Sabado Crystal Ball. And basically they go through every single race, and they will basically give it a toss-up rating or a lean Republican, solid Democrat, things like that. And I think that's just a lot easier for people to understand. Whether or not Texas is 4.5 or 3.4 or 5.9 for Trump is not particularly meaningful. But what is meaningful is, Texas is likely Republican. It would be surprising if Harris won that. And at the end of the day, that's what the average person wants. So I actually recommend these electoral race classification systems over polling aggregators.
Okay. I like your insight into what the average person is looking for. That's good stuff we're providing here. I think you're right, though. I think it does, to go into the minutia of polling and looking at error and things like that, it interests me. I'm not self-aware enough, not in a lot of things, but self-aware enough in this instance to know that that's probably I'm probably an outlier. And I think You're right to say, we want to look at people. Most people want to see what's going on in the race rather than what's going on in the poll. And that's probably genuinely useful. I think
there's a lot of evidence that we are the weird ones.
Yeah. My wife and children would agree with you. I'm certain your wife would probably agree as well. In terms of like what to do with these things, a step beyond like poll aggregators are the predictive models, right? Where they say, well, we've taken all this information from the polls and we put it with some other stuff to tell you who's more likely to win than not. And 538 and Nate Silver, distinct now, are leaders in this. The Economist does this as well. I'm not sold on the utility of these sorts of things, right? They come up with their own special formulas and algorithms. Like polls matter, but these other things that are going on in the real world actually matter too. But those matter less as time gets closer and closer to the election. And they're giving some sort of prediction based on projections that include a lot of error. And so I'm not particularly sold, but they can be interesting to follow.
Yeah. And I think this is where communication really is important, right? So if we go back to 2016, 538 said that Trump has a 28% chance of winning the election, right? Mm-hmm. But is it really 28% chance of winning the election? The way these things actually work is, they have a bunch of inputs, right? So they'll have something along the lines of like, okay, well, we expect voters under age 35 to come out in this percentage. We expect Black voters to come out in this percentage and to vote Democrat in this way. We expect women to come out at, say, 57%, and they will vote for the Democrat, let's say 55% of the time, right? Now, the way these models end up getting a hard number is that they will tweak these parameters ever so slightly, right? So instead of women turning out 57%, they might turn out 60% or 63%. And so they adjust all these parameters according to some sort of distribution, and then they plug that into the model, and the model is going to output a electoral vote number, right? So, for instance, if um, we go to Barack Obama, you had record high black turnout. You had record setting turnout for young people. Well, obviously that's going to result in an electoral landslide, right? So they run, tens of thousands of these simulations, and they get all these numbers, and then they get all these results, and then they just plot them, right? And they say, hey, out of these results, Trump is going to win 28% of the time.
Yep.
But that's a lot to explain, right? I just spent, the past couple of minutes explaining that. But it
still doesn't explain, right, what they're actually doing in terms of error. And if you think about it, they're taking data, polling data, which has error built in,
right,
and then they're leveraging it with their models, which are injecting even more error. And yet they're still coming up with very precise numbers like 28%, right? Which, again, extra precision just so they can say, hey, look at us, look how precise we are. Yeah. And another thing they're doing is they're projecting out of sample, right? Which most people don't care about the statistical things of this, but it's kind of, if you think about a baseball analogy, you brought this up before we were discussing it. I think this is good. Talking about sort of a batting average. When you have a batting average for somebody, you have a long history of their specific performance. So you can make a pretty good assumption that their next at bat, they're going to follow a similar sort of profile. You can make, it's probably this percentage chance that they'll get a hit based on what they've done in the past. You wouldn't look at one team's batting average and say, everybody in the major leagues is likely to perform at that level when they're up next, right? There's some correlation there because they're all professional baseball players, but there's a lot of difference between one team and the rest of the league. And that's what people do when they look at polls. Now, if you look at enough polls, the idea is, like you said before, that this error can kind of wash out, but you still get these hyper precise predictions based on leveraging stuff with a lot of inherent error, which, as if you go back to 2016, can leave a lot of people very disappointed and upset by the predictions not coming true.
Yeah. So I think, it's good to tell a story for how these results happen, right? So right now, The Economist, their model says that the median outcome is going to be 270 electoral votes for Kamala Harris and 268 for Trump, which is just a nail biter, right? And we know how that map is going to be. It's going to be, Trump winning Georgia, North Carolina, things like that, and Kamala winning Pennsylvania and the rest of the Rust Belt. So I think when you have these sort of median outcomes, you should tell the story of how that happened, right? So that it really brings home the message of like, hey, for this to happen, Harris has to win the Rust Belt. End of story, right? Yeah. I think if you communicate it like that, it just portrays the information in a much more digestible way.
I think that's true. And I think, I think then there's a lot of temptation, I think, for all these pollsters and these aggregators and these people who want to project the races to look really smart, because that will attract views and clicks and advertiser money. And it's not surprising that they fall into the trap of, hey, we're going to be really precise and tell you exactly what's going to happen because that's what you want to hear, right? Take into account when you're seeing these things that there's a lot of error in these things. And they can be right. Sometimes some things they're better off than others, but you can have a situation like 2016 where they're priming their viewers. Yeah, Trump's lost. He's got no chance. And then, wow, what happened?
I actually think 2020 was worse. 538 had Biden at 89% chance.
Yeah, that's true.
And
they claimed that they were right because he did win. But again, if you look at their projected electoral numbers, they were a little off.
Yeah. So I think if, based on all the inputs that occurred on the election, right? So if we knew that Wisconsin was going to have this amount of error, right? If you plug that into their model, all the actual parameters that did occur on election night, and you got the same outcome, then I would say that's a great model, right? Because based on the input, you got the correct output.
Okay. So I think after all this discussion, kind of a logical question is, well, what can you usefully take out of these polls? And I think one way that campaigns can make heads and tails out of what's going on here is to look into a little bit more deeply what the voters are saying. Okay, and especially I think right now it's useful for campaigns and for us to take a look at undecided voters. There was an article that came out in the Times this week that said 18% of the electorate is undecided. And while I thought that was initially a little high just reading it, then reading about how they define that as people that may be leaning one way or another but are still open to change, or people that are legitimately undecided. But 18% is more than enough to swing most races in the country, right? So if people are really that undecided, both campaigns really have to put some effort into this, right? And the polling can tell us some really interesting information about this. Specifically, the undecided voters are less white than, and more, I guess, minority than committed voters. They're younger and more male than committed voters. Okay, they're slightly less educated than committed voters, but most of them, like most voters in the country, don't have a 4-year degree. It's 63% to 62%, so it's not much of a difference. But they're very, as a group, pretty. They're not the most educated voters in the population. They're mostly self-described as moderates, 48% of them, but more of them skew conservative than do liberal. 26% of them skew conservative, and 18% of them skew liberal, right? And so all of this gives us a picture, and we'll just talk about in a minute, but I think it also gives a picture to the Harris campaign of, hey, these are the kind of people that you need to reach in the debate, okay? And so I think this information that we're going to kind of talk through in a second is stuff that should be, hopefully, at the front of their minds when they're preparing for the debate. How do we reach these people, right? Because, again, you need to get your people to turn out. But if 18% of the electorate still hasn't fully made up their mind, you really need to reach those people. And that's what a debate is really going to be helpful with.
Right. And so the debate's going to be on Tuesday. And I also want to mention that, I'm kind of skeptical of this 18% number. I think that 18% is basically saying like, oh, I don't know if I'm 100% committed.
I think that's accurate. Yeah.
You could be someone who is, as you said, liberal, right? You're probably going to vote for Harris, but you might be undecided in that you might vote for Jill Stein, the Green Party, or you might really be hurting economically. And so you might just say, you know what? Yeah, I think Trump is an asshole. I don't like that what he did with the Supreme Court appointees. But you know what? I got to feed my family, so I'm going to vote Trump, right? You have a certain level of squishiness. Now, the number of people who are just like, oh, I don't know, 50-50, I think that's much, much smaller than 80%. I think that's probably.
I would think so too. I would agree. I agree. I would agree. But I would think that there is probably a fair number of those people that could be persuaded either way.
Yes, I do believe that 18% are persuadable to some degree, right? Yes. Whether they're persuadable to stay home or persuadable to, jump the fence, right?
Yep. And so then the next question is, okay, these people might be persuadable. How are you going to persuade them? Right. And the Times had some interesting data from an Economist YouGov poll that they put out there about what issues are important to these uncommitted voters. And it doesn't line up perfectly with Harris loyalists or Trump loyalists. They're kind of in between, as you might expect. But they do highlight some potential vulnerabilities for Harris and Trump, and some potential opportunities for both of them. For example, Harris loyalists think that the inflation or jobs in the economy is the most important issue at a fairly low rate compared to Trump loyalists. 21% of Harris loyalists are most focused on economic issues, where 37% of Trump loyalists are most focused on economic issues.
47%.
47%. I'm sorry. Bad math today. 41% of these uncommitteds think that inflation or the economy is the most important issue. So that is a potential vulnerability for Harris and a potential opportunity for Trump. I would think you'd see attack ads for Trump on these things, and the Harris campaign needs to do a little defense on these issues. The economy and immigration as well, and taxes are issues where these voters, these swing voters, care more about these issues than Harris loyalists do. You can't pitch the same campaign to the swing voters that you do to your own loyalists. If they care more about immigration, taxes, and economy, you need to say something about immigration, taxes, and economy so it doesn't overwhelm you in terms of Trump saying, hey, you know what? You like these issues? You care about these issues? We care about these issues too. Okay. In terms of the other side of the coin, Harris opportunities, right? Swing voters care a lot more about healthcare and the climate and environment issue than Trump voters do. So Trump's pitch to his voters doesn't really work when it comes to swing voters. That's an opportunity for Harris to get in there, especially when you have Trump talking about saying yesterday that, you know what, climate change isn't our problem. So that's the kind of thing that can resonate with the swing voter that thinks, you know what, climate change kind of is a problem. That is an opportunity for Harris to get in there. Again, healthcare the same way, right? The Republicans and the Trump folks don't do particularly well with healthcare because they still have the reputation, well-deserved, of trying to get rid of Obamacare, trying to scale back Medicare, all kinds of things that people that are actually interested in healthcare don't really like. And there's a couple toss-up issues, abortion and civil rights, where the swing voters tend to care a little bit more than Trump loyalists, not a whole lot more. So there might be some ways in there for Harris to make some progress, and might be some challenges for Trump in order to hold on to sway some voters his way. But I think the biggest issues, right, is what can Harris do to fend off attacks based on the economy and immigration, and how can she take advantage of healthcare and climate? The obverse is going to be true for Trump. How can he push home the economy and immigration issue, and how can he defend against healthcare and climate issues if these issues are what are animating these undecided voters?
Yeah, and you could definitely tell that, you know, the Harris campaign is focusing on those obvious issues, right? The inflation, prices, jobs, economy, immigration, healthcare. You know, she's been slowly rolling out her economic plan. She mentioned a couple days ago, I think, the big increase of tax break for
the tax basis for small business.
Exactly. Yep. She also wants to kind of distance herself from Biden regarding the capital gains tax.
Yes, she proposed a significantly lower cap on the capital gains tax than Biden.
Exactly. And then immigration, as we discussed last week, the Democrats have been forced to move to the right on the issue, which I think for this particular campaign is smart. What I also find interesting is, you know, Harris is still new in the eyes of most voters, right? You know, for us, we have been familiar with her for many years.
Well, especially you out in California.
Right. But, you know, the debate is pretty unique because, you know, I'm of the opinion that debates don't really matter all that much. You know, a good debate will move the needle a little bit. But boy, did debates matter a lot this election, right?
I think we showed that a bad debate can really matter.
But this is going to be one of the most important opportunities for Harris, right? Because you're going to have tens of millions of people watching this debate. So you had the convention, that was one big event, and this is the next big event. So she can, if she does a really good job at explaining economic policy that appeals to swing voters, immigration policy that appeals to swing voters as well. And then going back to the bread and butter issues of that Democrats are good at regarding healthcare, right? So the Medicare negotiation for prescription drugs, stuff like that, getting that message out is going to be so critical.
Yeah, I think it's like oftentimes a debate hinges on who comes across better, who has a better performance. And I think that's going to matter, as it always does. But also, this is, I think, a little weird in that the policy opportunities might be a little bit more than usual in a debate. People might be more interested in policy than they usually are, simply because they don't know that much about Harris.
Right, exactly. So let's kind of pivot now and talk about, well, what are the states that actually matter? Right.
And I think, again, before we jump into that, I just want to say this is another really good use of polling data, right? Polls can look at, or campaigns look at, hey, who are these undecided voters and what do they care about? and then they look at, okay, where are these states that might be up for grabs, and what do we do? And I think that's why it's really important to look at what's going on in these swing states.
Right. And each swing state has a unique story, right? So, the big one right now is Pennsylvania. James Carville famously said that Pennsylvania is Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in between.
Having lived in Pennsylvania, he's not entirely wrong.
Michigan is unique in that you historically have a strong labor presence there. You have a large Muslim population there as well. And many people believe that the Israel-Palestine conflict is going to have some marginal effect there. Wisconsin demographically is also very interesting. It's pretty rural, except it's a very polarized state. So the cities are very, very blue. And then the rural areas are just super, super red. So in a way, it's a similar story to Pennsylvania. But the polling error in Wisconsin has been really, really bad as of late. In 2020, the error was off by 7 points. So they said the Democrats are going to win by about 7 points on average. But if you guys remember election night, it was a nail biter. Michigan was the same way. It was Democrats were overcounted by 5. Nevada overcounted by 2. Pennsylvania overcounted by 3. Arizona also Democrats overcounted by 3. But Georgia was interesting in that it was basically 100% correct. And when you start looking at where we are now, the Georgia race is dead even. And so what are the campaigns doing? Well, each campaign has $40 million of TV ads reserved between now and election day. $40 million each. That's just staggering. But it goes to show you that both campaigns really, really, really want this state. Trump, if he does not win Georgia, he's almost certainly going to lose the election. Harris, she doesn't need Georgia, but it definitely opens up a lot of opportunities in the Sun Belt area. The Trump strategy is really interesting because it's like they've given up most of the Rust Belt except for Pennsylvania. So in Pennsylvania, both campaigns have $70 million in ads each. I would hate to be living in Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
you're just watching TV and then you're just inundated with ads.
Do you get any political ads?
We do, but it's mainly for the propositions out here.
I was going to say, you probably don't get a whole lot of presidential ad spending out there.
Definitely not.
But I think what's interesting is if we look at this sort of list of the swing states, right, and you talk about the Rust Belt being the primary movers, especially Pennsylvania, and you can compare that to potential opportunities such as climate change, you don't see a lot of climate change ads for Kamala Harris because Pennsylvania has and the Rust Belt have some different priorities in terms of, hey, we do a lot of natural gas and oil mining or oil drilling. We do a lot of industry kind of things.
And
right?
She's had to pivot on her position on fracking as well.
Exactly. You've got to adjust. So this is kind of where you look at the polling comes together. You've got the polling about undecided voters, what they usually care about. But then you've got polling that shows you what's really going on in the states that matter, right? And the states that matter are not, so much Colorado, Washington State, and California, where people are really focused. There's a lot more liberals really focusing in on climate change. You don't see that as much in the Rust Belt, and the Harris campaign seems to recognize that, and they're pivoting accordingly. Right?
But I have to say, like looking at these like TV numbers, Wisconsin, Democrats have 33 million reserved, Republicans 3 million.
Yeah, it's weird.
Michigan, 55 million for Democrats, 6 million for the GOP. Arizona, Democrats are outspending the Republicans 3-1. North Carolina,
about that. Well,
10x.
You can talk about all of them.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's just crazy to me, right? Like if you're running the Trump campaign, you're basically saying, look, I have one strategy. I
Mhm.
think North Carolina is in the bag, number one, so I don't need to spend there. Georgia, we have to win, and Pennsylvania, we have to win.
Yep.
Everything
What I
else,
think
I'm
is
just going to concede, and I think
what I
that's
think is
nuts.
craziest about that, right, is if you think about, I think it makes sense to think of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania as kind of a similar set. And if you've completely given up on Wisconsin and Michigan, especially Michigan, I don't know
Right.
why you think you can write off Michigan and focus on Pennsylvania. I would think an appeal in Pennsylvania, if I'm designing campaigns, should sort of resonate with Wisconsin or with Michigan. If it's not resonating in Michigan, I'm really worried about what's going on in Pennsylvania. I think more so than the Trump campaign is at least letting on.
Yeah. So obviously this could change, right? Maybe uh, there's some internal polling that the Trump campaign has that suggests that, hey, you know what? The air is actually going the opposite direction now. Maybe they're just financially strapped
Yeah.
because, frankly, the Trump campaign has had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees. Um,
Do you think it makes sense that you could win in Pennsylvania but not in Michigan?
yeah, absolutely.
You think that they're that different?
If Trump wins Pennsylvania
No, no,
and
I get that, but I'm
oh,
just
okay,
talking about. Do you think you could appeal to voters to successfully win in Pennsylvania, but you wouldn't win in Michigan?
they're
That's
definitely
what I have a
correlated.
problem
They're definitely correlated to some degree, right?
with. Because the
Um,
results have been very similar across the last few elections.
but we do know that Pennsylvania is redder, right? So it could
You
just
know
be
what
a
I mean?
matter of, you know what, um,
Hasn't been
I
a
have
lot
lim-
better. I think the margins haven't been that different in my recollection between Pennsylvania and Michigan across the last couple of
yeah.
elections.
And maybe they're also worried about the Shapiro effect, right? You know, popular governor,
Could be.
really backing Harris, and they might need to combat that.
Yeah.
Um,
I suppose they could believe they have Michigan in the bag, which that would really be
or they're
surprising.
just giving up, right?
Or they're
There's
giving
that
up.
too.
But that's what I'm saying. If they are giving up, it would seem strange to me that they believe Michigan's out of reach, but Pennsylvania isn't. I don't know how you convince yourself of that causality there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a game of margins. So, for our recurring segment on economic policy, we're going to talk about tariffs. Both candidates have expressed support for tariffs to varying degrees. Obviously, the Trump campaign is very into tariffs, whereas the Republican Party as a whole has been pretty hostile towards tariffs. So that's an interesting conflict there. And then the Harris campaign uh, plans to keep most of the Biden administration's tariff policy. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But I'm going to hand it off to Jonathan. He's going to talk about tariffs at a high level. So yeah, take it away.
Okay, well, I get to bring on my political economy hat here for this. And then basically, I think what people need to know is tariffs are horrible. They're just bad policy in general. There's really no upside to having tariffs, and yet they're very popular. And so I think it's worth looking into why are they so popular if they really don't work particularly well. Um, and if you think about tariffs, right, what they do is they make foreign goods more expensive, right? We put tariffs on a foreign country. Say there's a 20% tariff, your $1 product will now cost $1.20. Okay. The goal of that is to, one, you could raise some money, but two, generally the goal is to protect and encourage domestic production. So say you're a domestic producer of, I don't know, you make shirts. We've lost a lot of our textile production to overseas because it's much cheaper. Say you make a shirt and it costs $12,
How
right?
about Make America Great Again hats? Let's
There
go
you
with that
go.
example.
Uh, yeah. Aren't those made in China? I think somebody discovered last time they were. I don't know. But in any case, suppose you make a $12 shirt, but the Chinese can make a $10 shirt, right? You're not going to sell a lot of your $12 shirts unless you can really convince people that the quality is so much better, right? And it's people like buying American. But if you put, say, a 50% tariff or 60% tariff, like Donald Trump is threatening to do, on Chinese shirts, your $10 shirt now costs $16. And all of a sudden, hey, my $12 shirt is great. People will sell. And so you might think, well, that's not so bad, right? We pay a couple more dollars for a shirt and we buy American. What's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that? A couple things. First of all, historically, if you're making your $12 shirt and your competition is all of a sudden $16, you're not going to sell your shirt for $12 very long. Very quickly, you'll see, I could sell my shirt for $15.95 and it will still be cheaper than the Chinese shirt. Hey, this is great for me. I'm raising my price. So you're raising prices on consumers ultimately in any case. But also at the same time, you're like, well, my shirt was better than the Chinese because the quality was better. But now their cheap shirt is more expensive. I can cut back on my quality too. I can charge $15.95 for a cheaper shirt and still sell them ahead of the Chinese, right? So you're going to be spending more money as an American consumer for lesser goods if you have to buy them from a domestic producer that's insulated. Now you may think, oh, this is just kind of hypothetical. You want a good example? Go look at American cars back in the 70s and 80s, right? When we had really high tariffs and we didn't let Japanese cars come in. The American car companies were producing overpriced garbage, more or less. The American cars broke down all the time. They weren't reliable. All of a sudden, Japanese cars come in, and the Japanese car companies are eating the big three's lunch, more or less. The big three had real crisis in the 80s when they couldn't compete very well with Japanese cars. Right? That's what happens when you have industry that just gets lazy because they're protected by tariffs. Okay. The other problem with this is that say, hey, China, we're going to add a 60% tariff to everything you do. Well, and China will think, okay, you want to protect your domestic industry. Well, we're going to add a 60% tariff to everything you want to send us. Might not be such a big issue with China because we have such a trade imbalance. But if we tried to do that, as Trump says, we'll put a 20% tariff on everything. Hey, EU, 20% tariff. Oh, okay. Everything you want from us, 20% tariff. And then more than likely, if we're familiar at all with Donald Trump, he gets mad at things like this. Things escalate pretty quickly. This is what happens in international trade wars. In any case, without someone like Donald Trump at the helm, you get a spiraling increase in tariffs as people try to outdo one another, and you ruin the global economy. And an example of that is the Great Depression. Right? We had a global trade war. People were having more and more tariffs. The global economy of trade just completely goes in the crapper. And if you think about how interconnected we are right now, that'd be a real problem for the economy.
Yeah, the pandemic was just a taste.
Yeah, exactly. Putting in massive tariffs would be horrible economic policy. And I'm not alone in this. I am a political scientist, so my expertise comes from political economics. All the hardcore economists, you can't find any of them that think, hey, tariffs are a great idea.
Yeah, almost every economist is anti-tariff. But
so the only thing sort of slightly in favor for trade control is that when you have globalization, right, there are going to be winners and losers. And the losers, people whose jobs go away because they go overseas, they really lose, right? So that's why we have tariffs. It's politically expedient to tell these people that got shut out by globalization, ergo people in the Rust Belt, right, that, you know what, this is going to bring your jobs back. But it doesn't do that. That's just not what happens. It just makes things more expensive and really can cause huge depressions if you really take it through to the extremes that Trump is promising to do.
Yeah. So let's go into that. So as you mentioned before, Trump wants to put 10 to 20% tariff on everything. Most people don't know this, but we're tariff free for the most part. There are some tariffs that exist that protect our domestic steel and aluminum industries, but for the most part, we are free trade. Now, China is different, right? Even before the Trump administration, we had some tariffs on China due to their trade practices. But then Trump, during his administration, wanted to levy a 25% tariff on basically all goods coming from China. And then the Biden administration did something interesting in that they've really ramped up the tariffs on very specific products, right? So let's talk about this 60% number that Trump wants to put on China. Going back to the theme of last week when it came to immigration policy, we have to ask ourselves, one, can he do it? And two, will he do it? So in terms of can he do it? Absolutely.
I think he could probably do it more easily than he could with immigration.
Yeah, definitely. So Congress has delegated a lot of their authority to the president when it comes to removing trade barriers. But in certain circumstances, the president has the capability of adding trade barriers, specifically in the areas of national security, as well as if a foreign nation is deemed to use unfair trade practices.
Right.
Now, there is a certain procedure that you have to go through. I'm not going to go into that. You can see the show notes for that. The Congressional Research Survey has a really good two-pager that outlines all the legislation that they've delegated to the president, as well as some historical trade deals that we've had with various countries.
I think the take home there for our viewers and listeners is that not only does the president get to respond to unfair trade practices, but he or she gets to decide who's having unfair trade practices. Right. So if Trump wants to do this to China, he just has to follow the procedures, and there you go. We've got more tariffs.
Right. So will he do it? Now that's interesting because we did mention that a lot of the Republican Party is very pro free trade. Think the Mitch McConnell wing of the party, which still holds a considerable amount of power. Trump also seems to have an affinity towards the prestige of certain New York financial firms, right? So during his administration, he had Gary Cohn, who came from Goldman Sachs, and Trump really, really wanted to add tariffs to South Korea because he felt like we had a bad deal with South Korea, both militarily and economically. But he being Gary Cohn, was able to sort of fight Trump's worst impulses there. There's also talk about Jamie Dimon being Trump's Treasury Secretary, right? Jamie Dimon, he's from JP Morgan.
See, I think all of this sort of is hinging on whether or not he'll go with qualified people or loyal people.
Right.
And I think every indication that he's given so far and anything that's come out of their campaign is that he's really favoring loyalists this time. They will let Trump be Trump and really back him up. I think the number of qualified people that you're going to get in these positions is going to be minimal, right? I think you're right to mention whoever he's put in these roles is important, and we should keep an eye on that. But I think it's kind of foolhardy to think, he'll put people in there that'll stop him from his worst impulses.
Right. There's no guarantee, right? Because Peter Navarro served in the administration as well. And he's very pro protectionist. He is an isolationist, and he went to prison for Trump. Like that's a pretty important thing, right? I should mention that Peter Navarro wrote one of the trade policy sections for Project 2025, which Trump has obviously never heard of.
I think you're going to see far more Peter Navarros in the next administration and Jason Millers than you are going to see people like Gary Cohn or General Mattis. You're going to see people that are the people that Trump likes, that they're loyal to Trump, and they believe what Trump wants to do is the right thing to do. Where the people that are like, you know what, my experience says that no, we shouldn't necessarily do this. I don't think you're going to see as much of that this time.
Yeah, I mean it's tricky because Trump at one point was very anti-TikTok. but then a particular donor donated to his campaign, and then suddenly Trump loved TikTok.
Yeah, but he will have already won. He will have won by the time this happens.
Of course. But it just seems that the person who spoke to Trump last is the position that
that's true. That
takes.
is true.
So I honestly don't know where we will end up when it comes to tariff policy under a Trump administration. So again, you mentioned, who do we need to watch out for, right? Secretary of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative. If he puts someone like Navarro in those positions, then leave the country.
Buy gold, I think, is probably the best advice.
It will not be good at all. But, if he appoints someone sane, then he probably won't engage in 60% tariffs with China. He might just stick with, say, 20%, which isn't great, but at the same time, it's within the realm of reason, especially since China really does engage in unfair trade practices. I just really don't want to fall into this trap of, the boy who cried wolf with Trump. One of the strategies that, the right wing uses is, well, everyone said that Trump was going to crash the global economy, start World War III, and yet here we are. Everything was great. I think it would be better to just say, hey, as you said, this is terrible policy, and just call him out for that. And hopefully during the campaign, he backtracks. And if he doesn't, you just keep hounding on him by saying, that's a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. I think that's the more effective strategy, as opposed to, he will absolutely crash the global economy.
Yeah, I think you can say that if we have a trade war, that would absolutely crash the global economy, and hopefully deter all. I mean, even if he is president, there is some sort of democratic opposition that will be in Congress that would hopefully be able to muster some opposition to these things. And if he starts us down this road and things tank like they always have in the past when we've had trade wars, hopefully there will be enough sane people left in other aspects of other parts of the government to say, maybe we need to step back.
Right.
But it's not the kind of thing we want to be banking on, though. It's
absolutely not. So, I alluded to the Biden administration, increasing some of the tariffs of that Trump had put on China. So this was interesting, and I didn't know this, but we had a 25% tariff on electric vehicles coming out of China in 2018. That tariff is now 100%.
Yep.
So
do you think that Elon Musk got to Biden when in fact he got to Trump? What's going on with that?
Yeah. Semiconductors, 50% tariff. Solar cells, 50%. Syringes and needles, 50%. Lithium ion batteries, 25%. Medical equipment, 25%. So on and so forth, right?
Yep.
So, you had mentioned that, in general, that this is bad policy. It's not good for the consumer. It protects only certain industries, right? I tend to agree with that analysis, but I could also see the argument about, emerging industries, right? So
Sure.
The electric vehicle industry in America isn't particularly strong yet, right? Tesla is clearly number one, but the number of cars that Tesla sells relative to, say, like Ford's, non-EV vehicles, it's just a tiny fraction, right?
Sure.
And we know that part of the environmental policy is to get more electrical vehicles on the road, right? So is this a case where this is reasonable?
Well, I think interestingly enough and conveniently enough for me, I think you see a sort of similar reflection of what we saw in the 80s with American cars. Because we have these high tariffs on Chinese cars, they can't send over their cheap cars, right? It insulates American car companies so they don't feel they need to make a cheap electric car or a small electric car. You have these companies, Tesla among them, but Rivian, all these companies building expensive luxury electric cars. Nobody has a cheap electric car. In fact, Chevy had a cheap electric car, but they've decided we're going to stop making that and make a more expensive electric car. I'm sure part of that consideration is we don't have to compete with the Chinese. Their cheap electric car is actually expensive over here. So why should we make a cheaper car that can compete with that? We can make an more expensive luxury car where we can make more money if we do it right. There's all sorts of issues with that. But for example, where's Elon Musk's tiny 2-door electric car for people to use in the cities?
Right. Yeah, it doesn't exist.
There's not one, right? There's no
I'm
reason
not convinced Americans demand that, though, right?
Sure, but again, if you're really wanting an electric car, right, don't you want to have the option to have something smaller and cheaper? There's no entry level electric cars, basically what I'm saying. The electric cars are more expensive than traditional cars for any number of reasons. Part of it because it's an emerging industry, but part of it because they're insulated against Chinese competition. If they had to compete with those cheaper Chinese cars, you'd see cheaper American electric cars as well.
That, or you would just give up, right? And we've seen this in other industries, right? With Taiwan, for instance, basically controlling over half of the world's silicon wafer production, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's difficult to come up with like a blanket tariff good, tariff bad policy. It really depends on the industry and it really depends on your goals. I think with electric vehicles, you're right. If you believe that climate change is I don't want to say existential crisis, but if you think it's like a really high priority and that getting more electric vehicles into the hands of consumers now is preferable, then I think having a tariff on Chinese electric vehicles is crazy, right? Because this tariff is going to hinder the adoption of electric vehicles in this country. Whereas semiconductors, I think that is more reasonable, just from a historical perspective and given how supply chains reacted with COVID, right?
If you think about it,
really depends.
The reason that they're over there is not because the Taiwanese invented this stuff.
Sure.
American companies thought, it's cheaper for us to make
they outsourced it. Yeah.
So it's not like foreign competition is overwhelming us. It's that American companies are like, I'm making this here. I can go over there and make it cheaper.
But they're just not doing a good job, like Intel.
if we gave them some incentives not to do that, like built things into our defense budget, whereas, hey, we're only buying semiconductors made in this country, or only buying steel made in this country, right? That would give them some sort of incentive that would be different than passing along expense to consumers. So despite what Trump says, when you raise tariffs on somebody, right, the companies don't eat that cost. They pass that cost directly to the consumers almost always. Right? So consumers, and the Biden administration has done some research, and they've got like, it's going to cost thousands and thousands of dollars to the average consumer to have these tariffs. And you can take that with a grain of salt because it's partisanly biased. But there have been some nonpartisan, non-political surveys that think, it probably costs the average family between $2,000 and $5,000 a year if Trump did put these tariffs in. So these are costs that are going to be average Americans paying to support these companies that don't have to compete as hard.
Yeah. And the government also has another tool, right? They can subsidize certain industries. So, protective equipment, rubber gloves for doctors, things like that. Instead of having a tariff, you could instead subsidize the production locally. But I do think that it might have to do with the fact that subsidies typically require congressional action. And Congress they've been pretty ineffective as of late.
So it'll be interesting, I think, to see how Harris addresses these tariffs next week in the debate, right? Because since she is sort of in favor of some tariffs, but not in favor of others, I'll be curious to see how she differentiates, easy for me to say, herself from Trump on this issue. So I think that's something for us to look for. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that next week when we talk about what happened in the debate, because that economics and tariffs are going to come up.
All right. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.